Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you all to all of our online viewers for joining us on today's webcast. My name is Michaela Townsend and I'm a marketing specialist here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. I'm very excited to introduce today's presentation of proactive security modeling adversarial behavior. In this webinar, we will introduce ScoutThreat, a threat management platform that helps security analysts streamline threat analysts' work and extract the maximum value from threat intelligence. Our presenters for today's session are LookingGlass Senior Product Manager Dan Martin and Security Ledger Editor-in-Chief Paul Roberts. Before we begin, I want to very quickly run through a few housekeeping notes and reminders for the BrightTalk webinar platform. Please note on screen that there is a chat window where you should feel free to submit any questions that you might have for our presenters. We will be addressing these questions at the end of today's presentation during the Q&A section. If we happen to run out of time before all of the questions are answered, we will be sure to contact you directly after the presentation. Please note that any questions submitted through the chat feature are only viewed by the presenters and not by fellow audience members. So if you prefer to have your question addressed privately, please indicate so in our comments and we will contact you directly if desired. So now, without any further delay, at this time, I will go ahead and pass this over to our presenters to kick off today's webcast. Dan and Paul, please take it away.
Thanks, Michaela. This is Paul Roberts speaking, and I am the Editor-in-Chief at the Security Ledger. We are a cybersecurity news website and really thrilled to be here, being part of this conversation with Dan and the folks at LookingGlass. So thank you to them for sponsoring this. It's going to be a really, I think, interesting and useful discussion for those of you on the line. Briefly about myself, again, I'm a cybersecurity news journalist and reporter. I've been covering the space as a reporter and an industry analyst for 16 years. Really, with Security Ledger, focus on, really the cutting edge of the information security space, from Internet of Things threats through to the types of things we're talking about today, advanced persistent threats, sophisticated cyber adversaries, and all the changes that those types of attacks and attackers are prompting in the information security space. So, and Dan, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So again, like Paul said, I'm also really excited to be here. This is a topic I've been thinking about a lot lately because we actually, as Michaela mentioned earlier, just had what we're calling kind of our soft release of ScoutThreat, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And anybody who's been involved in a product release knows that you don't get a ton of sleep leading up to that, so kind of bear with me as we go here. But a little bit about me. So I've been a product manager for a while now. I kind of fell into it like a lot of PMs do while I was at Lockheed. So I was there for about 5.5 years. I left to join a startup, and that ended as most startups do in about a year. And then from there, I moved on to contract to FINRA, where I was the PM for product supporting the Office of Fraud Detection and Market Intelligence, which is kind of an interesting segue into when I joined LookingGlass. So I joined LookingGlass specifically to kind of productize and commercialize the launch of products that were acquired from Goldman Sachs last spring. The first of those being ScoutThreat, which I just mentioned. So really excited to have this conversation. I've learned a ton, while I was onboarding myself to this product and, this space in general. And so hopefully, that provides some helpful insight as we talk through this.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, just a little bit about Security Ledger, seeing as this is an opportunity for you to get familiar with Security Ledger and LookingGlass, as well as learn some stuff. So again, we are a cybersecurity news website, and we do a variety of different things, including a weekly podcast called the Security Ledger Podcast. Shocking, I know. You can find us on pretty much every major podcast platform. Take your pick: Spotify, iTunes, and so on, SoundCloud. And we would love to have you as We also do, news and analysis via our site, kind of blogging, and we have a number of different weekly newsletters that you can sign up for as well, both the daily sort of cybersecurity news roundup and the weekly kind of news analysis newsletter. Finally, we do events. If you're here in Boston, I organize the Security of Things, a Security and IoT meetup, but we also do an event called the Security of Things. So if that's your thing, sign up for one of our newsletters. Dan, do you want to say a few kind words about LookingGlass, the good folks at LookingGlass?
Yeah, I would love to. So, LookingGlass, we've been talking about this a lot lately. The idea from, if you're kind of approaching the digital risk problem at your company, there's a lot of different, that means a lot of different things, right? Your employees are targeted, your brand can be targeted, your customers can be targeted. And so as we think through that problem, people are looking for a solution that's tailored to them. And, we're lucky enough here to have a pretty broad portfolio. So regardless of the maturity of your security operation or how much you really, want to invest in-house in that versus partner with folks like us, I think we have a good solution set for that. But it's really about, defining that problem for our customers and framing that in a way where we can be truly helpful. And so, Paul, I'll kind of hand it back to you if you want to just go through, the agenda for the talk today.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and again, as Michaela said at the top of the event, we are going to leave time at the end of this for questions and answers. Use the Q&A feature on Bright Talk to pose your questions, and we will get to them, assuming they're appropriate. But the agenda, we're going to start out just by sort of defining the advanced threat actor term and what we're talking about, Dan and I, when we're talking about this phenomenon of advanced threat actors, sort of sort out some of the nomenclature, because as we know in cybersecurity, a lot of times these terms get jumbled together in ways that aren't helpful. We're going to dig down on threat modeling and both what it is and what advantages there are to developing a tailored threat model for your organization, how that maybe is a little bit different from the way that your organization thinks about and responds to cyber threats today. And then Dan in particular is going to dig deep on things like threat actor scoring and risk scoring, really getting pretty granular with how you can use a threat model to address really pointed and high severity risks to your organization. And okay, so without further ado, I'm going to just dig in on this notion of advanced threat actors and what we mean. So, I mean, a couple different terms that get thrown around a lot. We're talking about advanced threat actors. Most of you have probably heard of APT, or advanced persistent threats, as well. And you've also probably heard of, nation state actors, the China, Iran, North Korea, Russia. So how do these terms all relate to one another, and are we talking about one when we're talking about the other? In some cases, yes, but in general, an advanced threat actor is not the same necessarily as a nation state actor, so it may be a nation state actor, but it may be a non-nation state actor. It may be a cyber criminal group. It could be a determined individual. It could be a ideologically motivated hacktivist group. There are a range of different types of groups that could fall under that threat. The term APT was, I think, originally in its origins was sort of a euphemism for China. It was what people who had access to classified intelligence started to refer to these nation-state actors, including China, as just to kind of euphemistically refer to them and not cause a diplomatic crisis. But the term is really much more general now, and an advanced threat actor is a term that really focuses on what is important, which is these are sophisticated sophisticated cyber adversaries that use a wide range of tools and techniques to achieve their ends. So that's really what we're talking about. Some answer, okay. So some examples of advanced threat actors, obviously the APT10, the APT10 group, which is also known as Stone Panda and Menu Pass. It's a Chinese group that has been involved in a number of high-profile attacks, and there was actually an FBI and GCHQ both warned specifically about AP10 a few months back. We know recently about the attack on the Marriott hotels reservation system, which is ascribed to a group from China. We've seen some very sophisticated attacks on, for example, oil organizations in the oil services group, including Saudi Aramco and even Saipem, which is a Italian oil services firm. Those attacks also not 100% clear who's behind them, but they show similarities to a group known as Oil Rig. So there are a wide range of these groups involved in attacks. They could be targeting a particular industry or sort of a basket of different industries, could be after trade secrets and intellectual property, could be out to cause disruption. There are a lot of different possible motives. What really ties them together is their effectiveness and their sort of persistence in achieving their ends. The characteristics, these groups are very patient. They are not smash and grab cyber actors. They will gain a foothold on your network and then slowly and deliberately identify, target, and obtain access to the IT assets and data that they want. They're extremely resourceful. And like I say, and others have said as well, their persistence is more of a characteristic than advance. In other words, while they often will use cutting edge techniques, be it novel malware or remote access tools, things that they have custom created, often their attacks are not particularly technically advanced or sophisticated. So for example, the APT10 group, one of their methods of attack was, phishing emails with malicious attachments, attachments with two file extensions on them, doc.exe. That's not particularly new or interesting. However, the persistence that the group used working across, over time and persistently to obtain access to targets was unique. And we'll talk a little bit more about other techniques that they use that made them of interest. There's as with every knowledgeable cyber actor, there's a big focus on what we call layer 8, employees, partners, business partners, supply chain providers, with the goal of getting access, even if it's to low-level systems, and then moving laterally within an organization, exploiting software weaknesses or configuration lapses to elevate their level of access and gain control over more valuable IT assets. And again, they are willing to take their time doing this. The Marriott breach, as we learned, may have persisted for years. It likely started not in their reservation system, but in another part of their organization, point of sale system. And then that actor was able to slowly expand their access until they had control over the assets that were most important to them. So these are all, things that characterize this particular type of group and that make them very, very difficult to ferret out and to counter, but difficult, but not important, not impossible. And that's actually what Dan is going to talk about in this next section, which is how to sort of model these actors and be able to intelligently and effectively counter their efforts to prey on your network, your employees, your data and assets. Dan, my friend.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So, I wanted to start out, Paul alluded to it, right? This is a large problem set, very wide and also very deep depending upon how you look at it. And, I've had the pleasure and kind of benefit of talking to a lot of our existing customers as well as a lot of potential customers in the last 3-4 months. That's kind of always part of a product launch, get out and prove product market fit. And in doing that, you always start with the problem you're trying to solve. And so talking through this, you can take a step back even further and say, threat intelligence, how do I even operationalize that, right? And so that can be overwhelming. And then when you think of the advanced threat actors that Paul just talked through, that in and of itself can be kind of a deluge of data. And so that causes a few things. First, it can lead to conclusions such as, well, we're not targeted by nation states. That's the least of my concern. I don't have time to think about this. And those are, pretty typical of a problem of this size. It's also because it is, I'll say kind of a hot topic. The more you don't have to look far to read the most recent reports of advanced actors. Every couple of days you see something else, and a lot of times they read like spy novels, right? So they get a lot of attention from executives that read things in the news, driving to work, and then that kind of creates an RFI that goes to the threat team. So you kind of see where I'm tracking with this, and some of that might be true. It might be true that it gets too much attention sometimes, but saying that you're not targeted or your industry isn't targeted, I would kind of challenge that a little bit. So kind of back to one of Paul's questions, where do you start, right? If it is this big problem, where can you start? And this is actually was my question when I kind of first joined LookingGlass and first took on ScoutThreat itself. And so one of the things, there's a little bit of background that you have to have, I think, when you're talking about threat modeling in general. And I have it up here as kind of a prerequisite as Intel 101. And I learned this the hard way. I tried to get into our application itself and the problem set itself without really understanding how intelligence worked or really what intelligence even was. And so when you're talking about approaching this problem, it really is something that the intelligence agencies and the military have been dealing with for quite a long time, and for a good reason, and they're very good at it. And so intelligence people, for lack of a better term, people with military intelligence and intelligence agencies background would tell you to start with intelligence requirements, right? Anything with a giant problem set is you have to know the questions you're asking first, because it's a giant world out there and there's a lot of different industries and you might only operate in certain countries, but these are all the questions you can start to ask when first setting out to put down your intelligence requirements. And then from there you can kind of move down, the intelligence cycle. And this is not the intelligence cycle webinar. I wanted to make that clear. There's a lot of great resources out there that you can kind of go and read more about the intelligence cycle, which I think now is referred to more as the intelligence process. And so I'll say, I have up on the screen here, JP 2.0 is Joint Intelligence, which was put out by the DoD joint publication, which goes over its guidance for conducting joint and multinational intelligence activities across military operations. So that's a great place to start. It's pretty thorough, but it goes over kind of this approach that I'm talking about. And another resource I'll put out there for people listening, if you want to kind of have some more background on this, is one of the people I did have the opportunity to work really closely with is Vince Peeler, who runs the Cyber Intel group at Optum. He did a dark reading webinar this past November. If you just Google search that, you'll find it. And he does a great job of talking about his background in naval intel and how he approaches the problem, in the private sector. So I think those are some great places to start. And without that, I personally didn't have a great appreciation for that. I often talk about having a learning curve, right? Anytime I approach a new product, initially I know nothing, and I know that. And then about a week later, I feel like I have a pretty good hold on it. And then a month later, I'm certain I have no idea what I'm talking about, right? So it's kind of this cycle that we go through, and Vince was really helpful in kind of pointing me in the right direction and saying, you really got to start by understanding the basics of intelligence if you want to approach this problem. So one of the things I mentioned was you got to know to ask the right questions, right? And one of the questions a lot of companies do want to ask when you kind of frame the question in that way is, what threat actors are targeting our industry, right? That's something people want to know. Like that's some intelligence people would want to have, and that's a scope that's a little bit more attainable if you approach it that way. So this is kind of like the first thing you have to do to kind of approach this before you just go off and start threat modeling whatever actors you think are most interesting. Moving on from there, once you've kind of established those requirements, right? And like I said, there's more parts to the intel process here, where you kind of go there and you define your collections and which sources you want to go to and your confidence in those sources. But you can get to the point where you want to then select a modeling framework, because if you go back to the question we had, if you want to look at threat actors that are targeting your industry, what you're going to want to do is build a model, like a logical threat model, that's normalized and consistent across the threat actors that you're looking at. And so, one of the more popular ones right now, in my opinion, for good reason, is the MITRE ATT&CK model. And I think they're doing some great things over there. It's not the only framework, but it's, again, as I've talked to quite a few companies, people are either kind of tracking to that or are planning to do some more modeling based on this framework. And built off some of the good work the folks at MITRE are doing. And when you build this model, what it gives you is kind of a common set of TTPs to build to. And in MITRE's parlance, they call those tactics. So at the enterprise level, they have 11 different tactics that you can map to, and the threats get more granular down from there. But I want to also kind of point out that threat modeling is another one of these, Paul mentioned before, an industry filled with buzzwords, right? Threat modeling is another one. People can mean this in different ways, right? From being a product manager, you could do threat modeling on my application if you wanted to. In this case, we're specifically talking about, threat actor modeling, right? Modeling the adversary. And the reason that you do that, right, is that you want to get to the people. And we all know that's really, really hard to do. I'm sure there's people on the webinar right now kind of shaking their head, right? Anytime I hear people use the word attribution, I cringe because I know how difficult it is. But the reason that that's the end goal, right, is because IOCs, indicators of compromise, don't have motivations. They don't have intent. People do, right? So from an intelligence perspective, when we're trying to know our adversary, trying to know why they're targeting us, the way that they use different malware, the courses of action, right? That's talking about the people, and that's really where I see kind of intelligence playing a huge role, kind of in the much broader cybersecurity problem. And so that also gets to the point of one of the bigger questions in threat intelligence in general is, how do I operationalize this, right? So okay, great. I've selected MITRE ATT&CK, like you said, and I've built out my threat actors, and I've done that per my intelligence requirements. But how do I operationalize this? What do I do with it? And that's a problem that I heard almost consistently with every organization I talked to in the last few months. And threat modeling, I think, provides a great answer to that, because it's from the perspective of the threat actor, and it's a risk-based approach to this problem where you're saying, hey, here's the attacks, right? And then the next obvious thing you do with that is say, how would we stand up to these attacks, right? Like, how would my organization, with the controls we have in place, how do we think we would do? And you have that honest discussion, not just with your threat intel team, but with your controls team, with your risk management team. And we think that is a really crucial point, because now you're working into that risk management program at your organization, and you're allowing them to see that you've taken what is kind of formerly really, really high level, hard problem to solve, but you've broken it down, you've standardized it in a framework, you're comparing people, or you're comparing these threat actors along the same framework, and it allows you to kind of give suggestions and at least highlight the risks as you see them. And so, Paul, I'll kick it back over to you, because I think we wanted to highlight really the state of threat defense and kind of continue that thought as well.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I mean, I think at a high level, one of the points we're trying to make is that threat intelligence is not just like a new bright shiny object in the information security space. That it's really something that if you understand how to use it and use it correctly, can really fundamentally change how your company, how your organization approaches responding to cyber threats, and take you from a very reactive approach or reactive stance to one that's proactive. And I know the word proactive is really overused, but literally one in which you're not simply waiting for bad stuff to happen and hoping that you spot and block it, or that you clean up for it after it in a timely manner, but one in which you really kind of get in front of threats and stop them before they happen. Obviously, again, I've been writing about cybersecurity space for 16 years, and I think we are in interesting times. And I think one of the big kind of meta trends you're seeing is that there is a really big shift in the types of threats that organizations are facing. I think much of the information security industry, in terms of the products and tools and technologies they're offering, are still based on an older paradigm, an older threat paradigm, one in which you had a kind of perimeterized network environment, and it was really about kind of spotting and blocking threats at the network perimeter, or failing that on the endpoint or inside the network, and that is really difficult to maintain given both the changes that are going on within organizations and how people access and use technology, but also because of the threats. Some of the same dynamics are still in place, right? So folks want excellent detection of threats and attacks without false positives, whether you're talking about messaging security or what have you. False positives can be costly and hurt productivity, and they're never good. There has been a big focus recently on the value of threat intelligence. I think most of us recognize that getting advanced intelligence, advanced understanding of would-be cyber adversaries, folks out there in the dark corners of the internet who are talking about your organization, who are poring over your stolen data or credentials or what have you, is useful. But the reality is much of that threat intelligence is often poorly integrated into the existing types of tools, technologies, processes that organizations have developed over the last, two decades or more. So there's a need to better integrate that type of information into, security processes. And that's kind of one of the things that we're talking about today. I think, the defenses that we have, the tools that we have are in some ways trying to be everywhere all at once, stop every threat, regardless of whether it is high or low priority. There's a lot of lip service paid to prioritizing defenses and efforts based on risk, but often the tools and know-how to identify and prioritize risks are lacking. And so that's another thing that, Dan and I are talking about, and one of the things that, LookingGlass and Threat Scout really are focused on doing, which is not just understanding what the threat model is, but what the threat model for your organization is based on, the industry that you're in, your own IT environment, types of adversaries who might be out there specifically focused on you and your organization. And as everybody on this line knows, man, headcount, human resources, finding the trained operators, analysts to come in and run your security program, be the boots on the ground, is a challenge. So the more that can be done to automate, especially low-level analyst work, to allow the folks that you do have to be more effective and more productive with their time, not get bogged down, crawling through, thousands of alert messages and other mindless tasks. That is a huge value for your organization because it's expensive to find them, it's expensive to retain them, and when they're working for you, you want them to be as productive and, frankly, as stimulated and interested and happy as they possibly can be. I think one of the things that, organizations need to do if they want to kind of pursue this model of proactive cybersecurity, want to get to the point where they are able to do modeling for adversaries. You do need to have some of the basic building blocks of a healthy information security program. It's not something you can start from scratch and just stand up. So you need to be doing all the basic blocking and tackling of a modern organization, whether that's on the endpoint, network, perimeter type defenses, whether it is having healthy and accurate log and event management, give you a sense of what's going on. Obviously, patch management, some of the other and patch and configuration management, some of the other core pieces that you need to manage the security on your network. I'm gonna hand it back to Dan, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about how to maybe go from where you are to being able to build a threat model that is specific to your organizations, that's focused, that helps you identify the specific risks, cyber risks, advanced threat actor risks to your organization, kind of from where you're starting, from where you are. So Dan, do you want to dig in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I think, I'd just like to go back briefly and echo Paul's point. As we've gone out and talked to different organizations, it's important to us for a lot of reasons, but it's really important for us to understand if this organization is at that proper maturity level, kind of from their security standpoint. Because if there are definitely things you want to do from a fundamental standpoint first, right? You don't want to just start at threat modeling, right? If you've got kind of a good patch management cadence, or you don't, right? That's a good place to start. So this is not for all those poor folks out there that are kind of the one-man cyber show, writing firewall rules and doing all the threat intel all by themselves. I wanted to highlight that because I think it's a really important point, and it's something that, as we talk to customers, getting better at it now, but I can pretty quickly tell if this is a good fit for a customer, or if, maybe there's something else, another solution in our portfolio that's a better fit for kind of where they are in the process. But if it is something that, you'd like to get into because you would like to be more proactive, again, as Paul was saying, we think this is a great approach. And I had talked a little bit before about, after you kind of choose a framework, building the threat models logically, but the real value, I think, comes, and this is something I didn't totally appreciate either, but it comes when you're actually rating those models, right? And so again, how the scale you rate these on, I've seen people do this, on sheets of paper, or they're in Excel sheets. but what you want to do is have kind of a common rating system across. So if you're thinking, back to the MITRE example, you're just kind of scoring the capability of that threat actor for each tactic, right? And below the tactics, it gets more complicated, where you might have different attack patterns or different software that they implement. But you want to rate their capability kind of in a vacuum, right? Because it is important to know, how effective you think they are in general at this particular vector or this particular tactic. And if you do that across actors, then again, that provides that normalized score, something that was kind of formerly data and info that you turned into intel that you're now assigning a score to, right? And that's important. But for a lot of the organizations we talk to, and for most organizations that are at the point where they actually want to start doing some threat modeling, they've made some pretty significant investments in their controls, right, to already actually bolster their defenses. And so what that means is, the example I often give, it was given to me and kind of makes sense in my head, is a threat actor might be really effective at a DDoS attack, right? Might be one of the better ones, more capable that you've seen out there. But if you invest in a tool to particularly, that is actually built to mitigate that attack, right? Something like Akamai, then to you, that risk is not as high, right? So you want to know about it. You want to, make sure that's logged, and that's what you do when you're rating the capability of the threat actor. But you also want to rate them against the very specific set of controls that you have at your organization. And that's really the key, and that's the part, I said before I didn't fully appreciate. It's a detail, but it's the most important detail. Because you have invested in mitigating these risks, you have invested in protecting your organization, so that risk to you is lower than a peer that might not have the same sort of tool. When you go through and you're kind of rating the actor at that level, the outcome is a score that's specific to your organization, and that's I can't emphasize the importance of that enough, from my perspective, because what that allows you to do is, academically, then you can rank the threat actors with their cumulative scores, so you can see which are the highest risk threat actors to you. And like I said, that's academic. It's kind of interesting, but it's not really actionable. When you go a layer below that and you pivot on that, you can start to see what the common TTPs are across those actors. Like, what is driving those threat actor scores up? The threat actor model scores up. What are the commonalities? Is it because you consistently rate yourself lower on one specific tactic that has this particular piece of malware in common? You're going to start to see those trends pull out, and people can kind of see, I think, where I'm tracking from here, because once you get to that point, right, once you're actually comparing them against your existing set of controls, that's where you can, have a seat at the risk management table, right? You can actually say, this is the way we approach the problem. This is the way we prioritize the risk. Here's our suggestions to address these risks. And at the very least, we should be aware of these. But at best, here's some suggestions that we've come up with. Again, you're working across your team here, because your threat intel team is not going to be the foremost experts on your controls. If you have a control catalog, that's a great reference that they can use. But there's going to be risk management teams, firewall teams, different groups that have more thorough understanding. So this is absolutely, a joint effort. And again, that's, that joint intelligence, the JP 2.0 that I referenced earlier, is gonna go into that specifically, right? Having people working together across your intel people working with your ops people. This is some of what you get out of that. But again, kind of to go back, to the point, I just want to reemphasize, this is work. It's not trivial, but it's the big stuff. In counterterrorism, again, kind of working with folks, I'm standing on the shoulders of people communicating this back to you, but, folks that work in counterterrorism intel refer to this as getting left of boom, right? And I usually say left of attack because I think it's important to kind of differentiate between military terms and kind of what we do. But it's the same idea where intelligence is really meant to get you to the left of the attack, right? I've actually had cyber security teams look at me and say our main goal is to know the moment that we get breached or the moment that we get attacked. And my response to that is, well, from an intelligence perspective, that's too late, right? That's failure at that point. So what you're trying to do is get to the left of that, if you think of it kind of on a timeline. And I think being able to, like I said, prioritize these risks, make suggestions, work through your risk management process, suggest controls, I think really kind of turns the way that private sector views intelligence, and kind of we'll really start to see the value of what it can bring to the table and some of the suggestions and ways that you can prevent yourself from these attacks that you're seeing and you think are going to become more prevalent, but most importantly, are specific to you. So Paul, I know you had some questions set up that we wanted to kind of talk through, and I know there might be some questions out from the audience too. So I'll kick it back over to you to go through those, or if you want me to highlight anything else in a little more detail.
Sure. And a reminder to the audience, we're sort of in the Q&A phase now. So if you have questions, use the Bright Talk Q&A feature to pose them to us, and Dan and I will try our best to answer them for you. So this is a good opportunity to kind of pick Dan's mind, and I guess mine if you want to, about some of the stuff we've talked about. So Dan, I have a couple questions just to start. One is, you talked about some of the resources that are out there for folks to familiarize themselves with sort of the intelligence piece of it. I guess I can imagine attendees might be wondering, so, listen, do I need to go out and basically find some former intelligence analysts who worked, in the government or military or three-letter agencies to come and work for me? Or is this something that I can train my existing information technology staff or folks maybe who are coming to me without a particular intelligence background or intelligence analyst background to do? Is this something that's learnable that way?
That's a really interesting question, and I've heard a couple different opinions on that. I will say from my personal opinion, when I've gone around and talked to people about this and gotten feedback and kind of kicked the tires just on the concept in general, and this is months ago, the folks that were really nodding back to me over the table were people with intelligence backgrounds, and people that did this for a living, and a lot of times didn't even realize that other people didn't know some of these basics that I'm talking about. So I think that background, if you can find it, is great. I will say there's a difference between intelligence analyst and someone who manages intelligence teams, and that again might seem like a detail, but it's pretty important because intel analysts are often great at writing intelligence products, and these are kind of finished intel, long-form reports. And if you're hiring them to manage an intel team, as we know, managing in every respect is very different than doing some of the groundwork. So those are kind of two things I'll say. But to answer your question more directly, Paul, I don't think that this is some secret that's off limits to folks. I definitely have a little bit of imposter syndrome myself when it comes to speaking to intelligence, but some of the great resources I mentioned earlier, I believe that this is something that people without that sort of background can easily digest. And it's not rocket science. There is a lot to it, and I will say people with a true intelligence, tradecraft, and pedigree are incredibly impressive at it. But they've said to me, that they're not limiting themselves to just hiring folks from, like you said, three-letter agencies or the DC area in general. I think having someone to run that program that does understand the value is really, really helpful. So that's just kind of my opinion on it. I'm sure people have others, but that's been my experience to this point.
Okay. We have a question from the audience, Dan. And again, if you're listening and you've got questions, use the Q&A feature on BrightTalk to pose them, and we'd be happy to answer them. Question is, are there threat catalogs that you would recommend to start the evaluation of threats to an organization?
That's a great question. So threat catalogs, so there's 2 points, and I think this is, again, a deep topic that we could spend more time on any one of these details. So let me start on the other side for a second. I mentioned control catalogs, right? And some folks out there at organizations might have their own control catalog, and that's great. If you don't have a control catalog, I would definitely suggest NIST published something called it's called Security and Privacy Controls for Federal Information Systems and Organizations, and that's a good place to start from a control perspective. From a threat perspective, I would definitely recommend if you've taken a look at the MITRE Enterprise Attack Framework. I mentioned that before, and people might be familiar with that. But if you haven't checked in a couple months, I would go back now. They've got what's called the Attack Navigator now, and it's a pretty simple, but in my opinion, pretty slick app where you can not only look at the tactics, the 11 tactics across the top, but it's got like the 244 or whatever the number is techniques underneath that. And you can actually drill down into each of those techniques, and it's going to give you not only the details, descriptions about them, it'll give you references that you can go out to. It'll say, which threat actors leverage them. Within this same visualization, you can actually say, hey, I want to look at all the different techniques that APT28 has been known to use, or Rocket Kitten has been known to use. I think they have something like 78 threat actor groups in there. So I answered the question a little bit backwards because part of the question was evaluation of the threat to an organization, and I think you have to have both of those, right? You have to understand the threat. But you got to understand, the controls of the organization too.
Okay, and Dan, I think a lot of people are wondering, is this the type of I look at it as like a crawl, walk, run type evolution, and I guess one question would be, before you're ready to implement tailored threat profiling program, are there things that you just absolutely have to have? For example, you absolutely need, like, for example, a SIM who have been, deployed and in use of your organization before you can realistically hope to do the types of threat modeling that you're talking about? Or is that not a prerequisite?
So I wouldn't call it a prerequisite. I would say for the most part, just because of the way the industry, and of course that depends if we're talking financial sector, healthcare, or these different verticals. I would say most of the time people that are interested in this now already, like you said, have some of that in place where they are, maybe they're consuming threat feeds that are high confidence and feeding those into their SIM or using kind of a platform to do that. And then outside of that have, another system that they're using to track their incident response team. Because again, if you do have, a threat repository, you do want to be monitoring for those in your network, right? These are some of the things that, like, of course, you want to do that. One of the challenges, I think, though, is just the absolute sheer volume, right? And even the pricing models of some SIMs. So, okay, we've got more and more threat feeds. That's great. If we pump those into our SIM solution, we didn't really realize now we're paying on a storage basis, right? So now you got to think about how you want to monitor for those, what's the aging priority, how do we define an old IOC? So that becomes a different problem and one that becomes a cost problem. So, I would say those are things that people have traditionally done first. But, I I think doing some threat modeling, again, thinking about how much time you want to invest in it is a different discussion. But I think looking at it from a high level, especially depending upon your industry vertical, and just at least doing a quick initial assessment, right, of how do you think you'd fare against one of these actors, when they ultimately attack you. And I think that phrasing I'm using on purpose because people are kind of coming around to that. A lot of times it was, well, what if this happens? It's going to happen, right? And it might not be these advanced threat actors, but what better way to go through the exercise than to look at, some of the more advanced folks out there and take a look. And so I think you can start small, right? It's not, you don't have to go through and, like I said, the 78 MITRE groups, you don't have to, model yourself against all of those. But I think it's a good exercise to start doing sooner rather than later.
Right. And at some level, if they're, if they are attacking you and they've been successful in compromising you, that makes them an advanced threat, whether or not they're, objectively considered an advanced threat by the community, right?
Yeah, that's 100% correct. Yep.
So Dan, at the beginning of the webinar, you mentioned a new product, ScoutThreat, that LookingGlass has done a soft launch on. Do you want to just take a couple minutes and talk about ScoutThreat and what that platform does, what it is helping your customers to do?
Yeah, I would love to. So we're really excited about this. I also want to thank the folks at Goldman Sachs who've been incredibly helpful in, like I said, helping me not only learn the application, learn the space, learn a little bit about the thought process behind building this, because it's a pretty unique positioning to be launching something in the market. It's not, it's not untested. It's something being used at an industry, at an organization that is well regarded at being good at what they do. So you've got that, but then there's always the problem of, well, do others approach the problem in the same way? Can we help them solve the problem in the same way? And how can we make it accessible to more folks to solve more of our customers' problems? So, there's three things I really like to talk about when I talk about ScoutThreat. Threat modeling we've talked about, and it's configurable in that extent. So if you want to use MITRE, like I've been referencing quite a bit, we can set it up so that you can leverage that framework. If you've already got your own threat modeling framework that you're using in some regard, we can set it up that way. It's really just important to select the threat model, to select the framework you want to use so you can consistently rate your actors. That's really at the heart of the application, right? We do some of the traditional, what people probably think of as threat intelligence platform functions as far as aggregating threat feeds, allowing for ingestion of unstructured data, prioritizing those, passing those along to your SIM. So we do those things, but our focus really is on building the threat model, again, for all the reasons we touched on. The second part that I like to mention is the risk scoring. And so, again, I emphasize the importance of that and then coming up with a score that is specific to your organization. Because a threat feed could tell you something is high risk, or it could tell you it's, a 90 out of 100. It doesn't really mean anything without the context, right? It doesn't really mean anything until you say, this is a high risk to me for the following reasons. And the third part, the third kind of differentiator, if you will, is the last and most important part, which is performing that gap analysis. So here's the highest risk threats. After I've gone through these exercises, and here's where our gaps are. Here's where we don't have controls in place. Here's where we think we'd be in a lot of trouble if we were, targeted by one of these threats. So those are the three things that we really focus on. And like I said, there's more to the application, but those are what we consider kind of the differentiators in the market when you look at a space that is crowded with a lot of different problems, and that concept of threat management platform or threat intelligence platform means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But we're really excited, to see who we can help solve these types of problems with.
And to clarify for the audience, Dana, when you were talking about Goldman Sachs, the ScoutThreat product is a spin out of Goldman Sachs. It's a platform they developed internally to help them, and then that LookingGlass bought from Goldman Sachs and is making available to a broader audience.
Yeah, that's correct. So they had a pretty broad platform that married both the threat intel team as well as the incident response team. And so there's a second product, we'll be launching later this year that deals with the incident response side. And I mentioned that earlier in the hour, making sure that your teams are working together, if possible, sitting together to get the quickest, most relevant response. But yeah, Paul, they did look in the market. They saw some of the solutions out there. And for what they were trying to do, which is kind of the approach we've been talking about here, which is really to be proactive through this frame of threat modeling. They didn't see anything out there, right? So they built their own. They do that quite a bit, I've learned, but they do it with good reason. They don't take that decision lightly, and so they built that for themselves. And then as they looked around and they actually won some kind of industry award for this effort. Noticed that there was a need out in the market, and as they were a longtime customer of ours in the intelligence space, and they said, well, we're not a software company, you are, and so this kind of makes sense. So yeah, that's how that all came about. So again, we're pretty excited about that.
Okay, I think we may have time for one more question from the audience. If you have a question, pose it using the BrightTalk QA feature, and we'd be happy to tackle it before we break at the top of the hour. Dan, maybe just give our participants a sense with a platform like ScoutThreat. I mean, how would that? Let's say you were being targeted by a actor like an APT10 or something like that. Or you were concerned about being targeted by an actor like that. I guess what would a platform like ScoutThreat, help your organization to do in terms of being ready for that and being proactive about addressing that risk?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I feel like we could do a whole hour on it, and maybe someday we will. But when we talk about the threat model, I focused on the threat actor, I focused on the TTPs. Those are pretty much the highest level threat objects we have. Beneath those, we've got malware, we've got what we refer to as observables, which is your kind of atomic indicators, your domains, hashes, IPs, all that type of stuff. As you build out that model, right, you start associating, what are the domains we know were registered by this email address, which is known to be used by this particular threat actor. Ideally, a lot of this work you're doing, like I said, to kind of get left of the attack. But in the case where you're seeing something more imminent, more real time, if you've got that threat repository built out with kind of all the known atomic indicators and the different malware known to be leveraged by this, and the campaigns that are known to be kind of ongoing, as you see some of those things pop up, either real time in your SIM, having that association built out, gives you your incident response team who's working with your threat team, gives them that clue that, okay, we saw this is in our threat repository, we're not really sure why. Is it just something that came in off a structured feed? Nope, it's actually associated with this malware, which is known to be used by this actor, and we know they've been active recently, right? It starts to make you draw those conclusions in a much quicker way, or at least know what else to look out for, right? A lot of times it's, if you see certain things happening in a certain sequence, that's when you need to be more concerned. And so having that, that full threat model built out, not just the actor TTP, but down to the much lower level objects, allows for that, if and when something should happen, you've kind of got that profile built out.
I think we're at the end of our time, Dan. I wanted to thank everybody who took the time out of their morning or afternoon to tune in and listen, and encourage them to, come and check out Security Ledger and subscribe. Dan, any final words for our participants?
Same thing. Just thanks to everyone for joining. Like I said, we're really excited to talk about this. We think it's a pretty big topic right now, and as Michaela mentioned at the beginning, if there's any questions, please feel free to send those our way. So I had a great time. Thanks so much, Paul.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys, for today's great presentation. And thank you, everyone that attended today's webcast from LookingGlass. A link to the recording of today's webinar will be sent out to each of you following the webcast, along with additional resources on this topic. We will also make this presentation available on our website under our webinars page for additional viewing. Feel free to pass this along and share this presentation with your colleagues. This final screen has some information on how you can find out more about ScoutThreat and LookingGlass. Please contact us via our website for more information. Thanks for viewing.
Bye, everybody.